we'll see how many people show up for worship expecting it to be Bible class. Happy daylight savings time to everybody. Hopefully, we'll all catch our lost hour this afternoon.
I almost didn't make it, but that's okay.
Yep. So Joshua 8, the sin of Achan has been dealt with, and the Lord has laid out for Joshua how they're going to proceed with AI. And what's the distinguishing feature of the Lord's plan for capturing AI?
They're going to sit and wait and set a trap for them.
Yes, they're going to lay an ambush.
Yeah.
Going to lay an ambush. And so that brings us up to where we finished last week, where Joshua chooses this force of 30,000 men, and he sends them out by night, and he sets an ambush. We're going to learn some of the specific details in just a moment for how that ambush is going to be laid, but he shares the entire plan with them. You guys wait in ambush. The main force, we're going to pretend that we're beaten and we're going to retreat. And once the men of the city come out after us, and we've drawn them away from the city, then you're going to go in, seize the city, and set it on fire. All right, so that's the basic plan. The last thing that we read last week was in verse 9. So Joshua sent them out, and they went to the place of ambush and lay between Bethel and Ai, west of Ai. But Joshua spent that night among the people. Okay, so that brings us to our text for today, starting at verse 10. Joshua arose early in the morning and mustered the people and went up, he and the elders of Israel, before the people to Ai. And all the fighting men who were with him went up and drew near before the city and encamped on the north side of Ai, with a ravine between them and Ai. He took about 5,000 men and set them in ambush between Bethel and Ai to the west of the city. So they stationed the forces, the main encampment that was north of the city and its rear guard west of the city. But Joshua spent that night in the valley. And as soon as the king of Ai saw this, he and all his people, the men of the city, hurried and went out early to the appointed place toward the Arabah to meet Israel in battle. And he did not know that there was an ambush against him behind the city. And Joshua and all Israel pretended to be beaten before them and fled in the direction of the wilderness. So all the people who were in the city were called together to pursue them. And as they pursued Joshua, they were drawn away from the city. Not a man was left in Ai or Bethel who did not go out after Israel. They left the city open and pursued Israel. All right, so a lot of what we just read is basically just a repetition of what we read at the end of last week. And we've noticed this about the book of Joshua, that it tends to kind of circle back on itself repeatedly. And we will get the same thing recounted to us again with some extra details. It's like, remember whenever Israel was crossing the river and there was some question about how many sets of memorial stones are being taken out of the river or put in the river? And it's just the way that the book of Joshua is telling its story, that it circles back on itself. So we learn some greater details about the events that we'd already seen. Right? So Joshua has taken these 30,000 men, sent them out by night. He sends out this ambush force. But we learn in this reading that it's not all of those 30,000 who were the ambush force. It's 5 of those 30,000 that are the ambush force. And so the rest, the 25,000 that are left, are the main force. So we're not supposed to understand that there's 600,000 men for the main force and then 2 ambush forces where one is 30,000 and the other 5. It's that the total fighting force is about 30,000. Wayne, I thought I saw your hand.
I was going to ask that very thing.
Okay. Well, that's why I said it.
It could be, having been in the military a little bit, I could see and understand how before the battle, I sent $30,000 here. But that was the force that was supposed to enter the city. then he says 5,000 after he comes up and camps out. Then he sends the 5,000 over here to ambush them coming out. When they came out, they surrounded them and beat them.
Yeah, that's not the way that the battle is portrayed later on.
Yeah,
There's
I'm just saying, I understand why that was.
Right, yeah. In English, it kind of comes across as confusing to us because that's not the way that we tell stories, right? We tend to be a little more linear about the way that we tell things. Whereas, at least this Hebrew author likes to circle back on things a lot. So that we get this building effect. And then part of what he's doing is he's building tension here. So we already know the plan. We already know generally what's going to happen. And so it's like, I guess part of it is, you could think of it as the Holy Spirit keeping our interest. Right? Because how do you keep someone's interest in a story if they already know exactly how it's going to end? we already know the end of the story. The name of the place, AI, is the ruins. Right? How do we think this story is going to end? And so we're building tension here in the story.
It's interesting that they call themselves that.
Well,
I wonder if they call themselves something else, and then it's the Lord.
I think that that's more likely what's going on. Because, and we'll see this later in the chapter. Remind me and we'll circle back to this. But the chapter will tell us explicitly later on that the place becomes a heap of ruins even to this day. Right? And it's the typical sort of thing where the text explains the meaning of the name to us. Right? So this is the story of how AI got its name. But that name is read back into the story even when, they probably do not refer to themselves as AI at this point in time. It's how Israel remembers the place and how we are to remember the place. It's a ruin. That's what's important about it. All right. Let's see. Hey, while we're talking about the disposition of the forces and kind of the way that Hebrew deals with things a little bit differently than English does, I want us to consider the placement of the forces. All right. So the Lord has told Joshua to lay an ambush against the city behind it. All right, so from our way of thinking, all right, so let's say that here's the city, and let's say here's you, and you're going to lay the ambush behind the city. So where is the ambush relative to you? On the opposite side, right? This is the way that we think of doing something behind something else. We learn in our text that that's not exactly how we should understand what's going on. First off, the text tells us that our expectation is wrong. It's pretty clearly laid out even in English. Go to verse 13. So they stationed the forces, the main encampment that was north of the city. All right, so let's say that we've got AI here. And you've got the main encampment north of the city. Let's see. And its rear guard, literally its heel, west of the city. The west is... The ESV is supplying the meaning for us here. It's literally the seaward side of the city. So somewhere to the west of the city, between Bethel and Ai. Now, here's the thing. So we could be talking about potentially somewhere over here. We are not exactly sure in modern times where the site of Ai is. And that makes sense, right? Because it's been a ruins for thousands of years now. There is a site southeast of Bethel that there's general consensus that this is probably the place where Ai was. All right, so you've got Ai over to the east of Ai. You have Jericho, where Israel is coming from. And then you have Bethel up to the northeast, which would place the ambush force somewhere more like around here. Which, again, to our English-speaking minds, that doesn't look to us like behind. Right? That's just, again, Hebrews dealing with things a little bit differently than we would think about them. The word for behind is literally after, or in other words, like off to the side. I want us to get this image in our minds, because as the battle happens, I think it's easy for us to imagine that this ambush force is on the opposite side of the city, and they can't see what's going on, because they have the city in the way. When what's really going on is that this ambush force very likely can see the men of Ai coming out of the city and going after Israel to begin with. So just want us to get that image clear in our minds of what's going on. That the ambush force is not out in the dark, as it were. Let's see. Yeah, John?
This was a fortified city, correct?
Yes.
With a wall.
Yeah, it's a walled city.
Yeah. So, and then they usually have multiple gates. But
Sometimes.
was everything maybe in relationship to what they consider the main gate?
Mhm.
In other words, it was behind the main gate. Because that's where most likely they would have been coming out of, would have been the main gate.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it, because more than likely, in the way that most ancient settlements were laid out, at least walled settlements, the main gate would probably be to the east.
Oh, would it really?
Yeah, that's they tended to orient themselves towards the east, kind of the same way that we orient ourselves towards the north. We don't know that for certain with AI. We just say that, but there's a fairly good chance. So that might be a good way of thinking about it. Okay, so the first thing that we read in this passage, I think it's important to note this, is that Joshua rose early in the morning, verse 10. All right, and we've seen this before signify obedience. All right, we noted it first with Abraham back in Genesis 22. Here in the text of Joshua, it becomes kind of a running thing in the book, that whenever Israel is going to obey God, they rise early in the morning, and it always starts with Joshua. Joshua rises early. And so we've had this break in the story where Israel has been disobedient. But now that is fixed, and we have returned to this pattern of obedience, and so we see things that we are used to. Now, funny thing about this passage is that who else rises early in the morning? The king of Ai and his people. They hurried up and went out early to the appointed place towards the Arabah to meet Israel in battle. All right, so the text is being a little ironic with us here, because the king of Ai and his men also go out early to meet Israel in battle because they think they have the upper hand. Right? They've gone to bed. Joshua has arranged these forces during the night. They get up in the morning and they see, oh, there's Israel again. I guess that we didn't give them a good enough licking the first time. Right? They're back for another beating. And so they rush out of the city, eager to go beat them again. And Ai is so eager, basically like the last half of that passage is focusing on how eager Ai is to go out and do battle with Israel, thinking they're going to beat them again. They are so eager to do battle with Israel that they make two really huge blunders. They send all of their fighting men out. There's no rear guard. There's nobody staying behind in the city. They are so confident that they send everybody out to address this main force of the Israelites. And they leave the city open. That's the last thing that we read in the passage. They left the city open and pursued Israel. And this provides us with a neat little contrast to Jericho. So remember, what we read about Jericho is that the city is shut up, that nobody goes in or out. And the point of that text is that God shows us that doesn't matter. That God is going to have his victory even whenever the gates are shut, even whenever the wall is an impediment. Now we've got another city where the gates are wide open. And guess what? God still wins, right? It's kind of again, you get this pairing to show the full range of the Lord's victories. It doesn't really matter if the city is shut up or if it's wide open. The Lord is going to deliver the city into Israel's hand. All right, any questions or comments about that passage before we continue on to the next? Solomon?
So, I don't know if you're going to explain this now, but basically, how you have it there, so the 30,000 are up at the top north.
Yeah, so let's say we've got 25,000 here.
Okay.
We've got 5,000 here, the ambush force.
Okay, and so AI is going up north trying to attack the 25, and then while the 5,000 are sitting on the side, they're going to go into the city and destroy it.
So yeah, so basically the main force is going to engage in a feint.
Okay.
They're going to retreat possibly to the north, possibly towards the east,
Okay.
somewhere away from the city towards the Araba, towards the wilderness.
I got you.
And once AI's main force has been drawn away after them, then the ambush force is going to come in, and they're just going to walk in the front door.
That's awesome.
Yeah, because they have left the gates wide open.
That's so
This is a very satisfying story from a military standpoint. So, good question. Any other questions or comments before we continue on? All right, verse 18. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Stretch out the javelin that is in your hand toward Ai, for I will give it into your hand." And Joshua stretched out the javelin that was in his hand toward the city. And the men in the ambush rose quickly out of their place, and as soon as he had stretched out his hand, they ran and entered the city and captured it. And they hurried to set the city on fire. So the men of Ai looked back. Behold, the smoke of the city went up to heaven. And they had no power to flee this way or that, for the people who fled to the wilderness turned back against the pursuers. And when Joshua and all Israel saw that the ambush had captured the city, and that the smoke of the city went up, then they turned back and struck down the men of Ai. And the others came out from the city against them. So they were in the midst of Israel, some on this side and some on that side. And Israel struck them down until there was left none that survived or escaped. But the king of Ai they took alive and brought him near to Joshua. When Israel had finished killing all the inhabitants of Ai in the open wilderness where they pursued them, and all of them to the very last had fallen by the edge of the sword, then all Israel returned to Ai and struck it down with the edge of the sword. And all who fell that day, both men and women, were 12,000, all the people of Ai. But Joshua did not throw back his hand with which he had stretched out the javelin, until he devoted all the inhabitants of Ai to destruction. Only the livestock and the spoil of that city Israel took as their plunder, according to the word of the Lord that he commanded Joshua. So Joshua burned Ai and made it forever a heap of ruins as it is to this day. And he hanged the king of Ai on a tree until evening. And at sunset Joshua commanded, and they took his body down from the tree and threw it to the entrance of the gate of the city and raised over it a great heap of stones, which stands there to this day. Excuse me. All right. So one of the key features of this battle, besides the ambush, which we've already learned about, is another interesting detail that this passage focuses on, and it's the role of Joshua in the battle. Right, the Lord tells Joshua, "Stretch out the javelin that is in your hand towards Ai, for I will give it into your hand." Right, and that's the last that we read about it for a while. Like we might be inclined to think, oh, it's just a signal. He raises up his javelin, and the ambush force sees it from afar, and they go in and attack the city, and Joshua doesn't have to keep his hand up. But then we learn later in the passage that Joshua keeps his hand up the entire battle and doesn't bring his hand back down until the battle is completely finished. Every last one of them has fallen by the edge of the sword. All right, so this might remind us of a couple of other events in Israel's history. Now, what's this remind you guys of?
When Moses had his hands up.
Yes, that's the main event that I think is supposed to come to our minds, is the battle against Amalek that we read about in Exodus chapter 17. And in fact, if you don't remember the story, let's go ahead and just get that briefly. Exodus chapter 17. Verse 8. Then Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, "Choose for us men, and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand." So Joshua did as Moses told him, and fought with Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. Whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed, and whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew weary, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it, while Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on either side, and one on one side and the other on the other side. So his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. And Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the sword. All right, so interesting parallel here, because not only have you got that that main thing about holding the hands up until the battle is done, but this also happens to be, if I remember correctly, this is Joshua's first battle as a military commander, at least the first one that is recorded for us. And so there's something I think that's fitting about this military victory in Joshua 8, mirroring that first victory that the Lord gave to Joshua. All right, and we should notice, by the way, this is the first real military conquest in the book of Joshua. All right, Jericho, again, there was no fight in Jericho, like we've said. This is the first battle that we see. And it mirrors that first battle that Joshua had against Amalek. So you've got the hand being outstretched, except now, not only is Joshua the commander over the Lord's army, not only is he the general who's in charge, but now we see him stepping into the place of Moses. Which this is a big theme in the book of Joshua, is that Joshua is Moses' appointed successor, and how well is he going to fill those shoes? And we see him filling those shoes here. Not only is he keeping his place as a military commander, but he is also, at least so far, a fitting replacement for Moses, since he's doing the same sort of things with Moses. We might also think of the Red Sea crossing, because Moses also stretches out his hands there at the Red Sea crossing, once to divide it and once to bring it back down. And we get some similar imagery in the Red Sea crossing as well, because remember, Israel crosses and Egypt goes down in after them, and they're surrounded on both sides by the sea, and then the sea just comes crashing down on them. And we find a very similar thing happening to Ai here, where Ai is drawn out after Israel, chasing after them, and suddenly they find themselves surrounded and overwhelmed. And so again, you get Joshua being put in the place of Moses. All right, so we get kind of the conclusion to the battle, that the ambush works, just like the Lord said that it would. And we notice that this pattern of obedience is continuing, because the men do exactly as Joshua had told them, which is exactly as the Lord had told Joshua. Joshua instructed the ambush force to set the city on fire, and that's the very first thing that they do. As soon as they get the signal, they go into the city, they set it on fire. And so you get this interesting thing going on, where the javelin that Joshua holds up, it works as a signal for the ambush force, and then the ambush force sets the city on fire, which is a signal back to the main army that the plan has worked. And that is Joshua's cue to turn the army back around and start engaging Ai in battle. It's also Ai's cue that they've been beat. Because the men of Ai turn around, they look back, and behold, the smoke of the city went up to heaven. When you hear that, the city described in that way, the smoke of the city went up to heaven, what kind of image does that evoke in your mind? What kind of language is that? What's that make you think of? Besides just the city being on fire.
The Mount Sinai.
Yeah, Mount Sinai, that's a good one because you see the smoke coming up from the mountain there as well, signifying the Lord's presence. Right? And I want us to focus on that language of the Lord's presence because there's, I think, another image that is evoked from the city being on fire, and that's the burnt offering. Right? The whole language of the burnt offering is that we use this language sometimes in talking about our worship, that the smoke of the offering goes up as a pleasing aroma to the Lord. That's the language that we use pretty often today. And so AI turns back and they see the city, and the city is being offered up like a burnt offering. And that just really makes a whole lot of sense in this story. Because what is AI? It's not just the ruins, but what has the Lord told Israel about the city of Ai? It is to be devoted to destruction. It is Terem. It is holy to the Lord in that sense. It's to be devoted to the Lord. And so I think maybe this helps us make sense of what the Lord is talking about whenever he calls a city Terem. That we see the city of Ai being offered up as it were, a burnt offering. And so in that way, it is devoted to the Lord.
So you were basically saying that their destruction created a pleasing aroma to God.
That is the sense that I think we're supposed to take away from the text. Yeah,
Just like we were sharing last week about the prayers of the saints.
yes.
Being a pleasing aroma.
Given up as
to
an
God.
incense.
Yeah, and being a pleasing aroma because you're seeing the symbolism here of the sacrifice and also the destruction here being a pleasing aroma.
Yeah, because a big part of what's going on in the conquest, we want to get like a big picture view of things, is that atonement is being made for the land. Right? So we can take this all the way back to Egypt. Why does Israel have to spend such a long time in Egypt? Right? God tells, I think he tells Abraham in, I forget, is it Genesis 17? He tells Abraham that his children are going to sojourn down in Egypt, and they're going to be there for a long time. And he tells Abraham why they're going to be there for a long time. It's because the sins of the Amalekites are not yet complete. Right, that's the reason that God gives. He is keeping Israel, he's going to keep Israel in Egypt until the sins of the people, the pagans who lived in the promised land, have come to completion and it's time to destroy them. All right, now we learn in the law of Moses what the sin of the people does to the land. Sin, it doesn't just corrupt the people, it corrupts the land. And so what does it take for Israel to receive that land as a fitting inheritance from the Lord? It has to be cleansed first. And that doesn't just mean killing all of the heathens who lived in the land. Right? That requires sacrifice. That requires atonement. And part of what's going on, I think, again, big picture, is that these pagan cities are burning to appease the Lord's anger and to cleanse the land, to make atonement for the land. Right, Wayne and then Solomon.
This kind of brings up another memory of mine. Having studied this a little bit from Josephus about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. It's the exact same thing.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that.
And the Roman armies push all the leadership of Jerusalem into the temple area.
Yeah.
And they got them surrounded, and they're killing them Well, somebody throws a torch into the temple and catches on fire. So you got this image right here again, temple's on fire. They're in the middle between the Romans and the fire, and they get slaughtered until every single man, woman, child is there.
That's a good parallel. I hadn't considered that, because one of the main thrusts of the gospel is that the Messiah's arrival is a form of judgment on Israel.
Yes.
And so we find Israel suffering all kinds of things as judgments against them that we see in other places in the Scripture. And I think this is an example of that. So, very good. Solomon?
There's a common theme whenever there's, well, this is the only other place I know of it, but I'm sure there's upstairs in other places, where they take the kings. They always take the kings and then hang them.
Yeah, because the king is representative of the people.
Yeah.
Exactly. And this was fairly common practice in the ancient Near East. To take the king and to make a display of the king, or in this case specifically, to hang him. We can read of plenty of other instances where the king is paraded around.
But the king on this one, though, was after all the people had been destroyed. I mean, looks like they would have come to the king before the people to say, this is what's going to happen, and then destroy him. I see backwards.
So
it's an interesting
There's no one there.
So the reason, so that's Numbers 25:4. They take all the chiefs of the people and hang them up before the Lord, to the Lord before the sun, that the fierce anger may turn away from Israel. So when the Lord is seeing the destruction of these people, it's actually pleasing to him because their people is being purged. So Numbers 25:4. In the ESV, it renders it take all the chiefs of the people and hang them in the sun before the Lord, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away. So it's not that they're setting an example; it's actually for Yahweh. It's for him to see their destruction.
A ritual display.
Right.
Yeah. I think there's probably something to that.
Wouldn't you think so that other countries would hear about that?
Absolutely.
Because they all do.
Absolutely, because word had been going around. So they absolutely are going to hear about it. And furthermore, I think maybe one of the big things behind hanging the king in the way that they did is they're not just hanging him, but they're also setting up a cairn, a heap of stones for his grave.
Like an effigy kind of.
Yeah, and we're told that his grave remains to this day. Right? So his hanging is not just a display for the people around them, but it's also meant to be a memorial for times later on.
I mean, just like Jesus' crucifixion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not only was that there to penalize the person who did the crime, but it was also meant as a reminder to everybody else that, hey, if you do this, this could be you.
Yeah,
not
remember your
embarrassment
place.
for the family, you know. They believed that there was over 3,000 crucifixions when Jesus was crucified, and that week goes on. Think about that number. That's a crazy number, but it was meant to teach the people. Maybe it was even meant for the Israelites to see, because there was no one there other than the Israelites at this point that, hey guys, make sure you live out God's commandments completely, not 99% of them, but completely.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. Okay, so to wrap this up for today, last couple of things I want us to note is, like we were talking about earlier, this passage kind of gives us the name behind Ai. All right, so in verse 28, Joshua burned Ai and made it forever a heap of ruins as it is to this day. All right, which, again, explains the name to us. That's why it's called Ai, is that it is a heap of ruins, as it is to this day. All right, and then the king is hanged. Let's see, at evening they took his body down from the tree, threw it at the entrance of the gate of the city, raised over it a great heap of stones, which stands there to this day. We're going to have more to say about this, I think, next week. But what I want you to store away in the back of your mind is to notice how many memorials are being set up here already in the book of Joshua. You've got Gilgal, you've got Jericho, which has a curse on it. You have Achan, you have Ai, along with the king of Ai. We're going to next week read about another set of memorial stones that get set up on Mount Ebal. Memorials are a huge, huge deal in the book of Joshua. So the very last thing I want us to note is this king of Ai is dealt with, buried in exactly the same way that Achan is. And I think that should inform our understanding of Achan. We said this, I think, when we went through the story, that Rahab and Achan kind of move in opposite directions. Right? Rahab is a Canaanite who becomes an Israelite through her confession of faith. Achan is an Israelite who becomes a Canaanite through his faithlessness and by taking the harem. Right? He becomes harem himself. He becomes contaminated with the same contamination that the Canaanites have. And so he has to be put to death. And we find that he is buried in exactly the same way that this Canaanite king is buried. And their graves are both set up as memorials, even to the day of Joshua's fighting. All right. We're a little past time, so we need to close it up there. Thank you so much for your questions and comments and your